Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, we're jumping right into a really fascinating space today. The exact point where cutting-edge longevity science collides with strict commercial reality. We're going to unpack a brilliant synthesis of biological theory and, more importantly, the actual corporate framework it takes to pull this off in the real world. Right from the jump, we have a dual mandate. We aren't just looking at science in some isolated vacuum here. No, we're mastering the clinical operations of an 8-target biomarker panel, while at the same time enforcing absolute commercial accountability. You literally cannot have one without the other if your actual goal is to deliver real value to patients. So here is our roadmap for getting there. First, we'll target the root cause. Second, look at commercial anti-aging history. Third, break down the 8 biomarker panel. Fourth, contrast the academic versus commercial mindset. Fifth, get into standard operating procedures. And finally, validating the clinical story. Part 1. Target the root cause, shifting the paradigm. Think of disease like a giant tree. This unified aging tree concept perfectly captures exactly why traditional drugs so often fail. They're basically just treating the branches, things like heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, or neurodegeneration. But cellular aging? That's the hidden root system causing 7 out of the top 10 global causes of death. So our strategy is to test those specific cellular roots way down at the bottom, totally preventing the branches from ever becoming a problem in the first place. Part 2. Commercial anti-aging history, a demographic awakening. So what was the absolute turning point for all of this? The year 2000. When the post-war baby boomers started hitting 60, the concept of aging transformed literally overnight. It went from this quiet, niche academic interest into a massive, immediate commercial and demographic crisis. You know, early academic observations on cellular and muscle aging actually stretch all the way back to 1957, but they mostly just sat dormant through the 90s. The real spark? That was a pivotal 1992 Harvard milestone. Dr. Rudman injected growth hormone into older men and measured the downstream IGF-1. This was huge. It provided the very first human data on anti-aging interventions, and that directly paved the way for the massive commercial explosion we saw in the year 2000. Now, here's the really crucial takeaway. Normal reference ranges in the body are highly dependent on your age. Hormonal cascades, like growth hormone driving IGF-1 production in the liver, they actually peak when we're just 18 or 19 years old. Just think about that for a second. Without some kind of intervention, our body's regenerative signals are just locked in this continuous, relentless decline starting right in our early 20s. Part 3. The 8 biomarker panel, decoding rejuvenation. To actually make sense of these markers clinically, we group them by physiological function. In the first quadrant, which is reproduction and stem cell maintenance, we're tracking factors like IGSF1 and FGF8. This lets us monitor tissue plasticity, injury recovery, and overall stem cell health. Then, over in quadrant 2, for repair and anabolic maintenance, we measure IGF-1 for somatic cell growth and neuronal survival, right alongside TFRC, which carries iron in the plasma to prevent iron-induced cell death. Moving right along to quadrant 3, which is extracellular matrix rejuvenation, we measure things like EGF. This is basically the ultimate collagen booster. It reduces wrinkles and heals skin damage. And finally, quadrant 4 tracks immune regulation. Here, we use markers like KDR to promote vascularization and stop sarcopenia, which is just age-related muscle loss. So you can see these aren't just a bunch of random laboratory tests thrown together. Together, they form this highly structured, incredibly precise diagnostic map of the body's entire aging process. We're talking about reading repair mechanisms, immune regulation, and cellular maintenance all at the exact same time. It's truly a master map of rejuvenation. Part 4. Academic versus commercial mindset, the tonal shift. Now, here is where the rules of engagement completely change. Back in an academic lab, dropping a beaker was honestly no big deal. Just a little learning opportunity, right? Well, that kind of unchecked freedom is entirely incompatible with the commercial world. A commercial business demands strict systemic accountability and absolute adherence to standard operating procedures. The reality of making this translation is pretty stark. Your past academic prestige holds zero weight here. In a commercial environment, you're measured entirely by your reliable execution, your clear communication, and the actual measurable value you generate for the company. You're there to execute assigned tasks, not go off pursuing individual rogue discoveries. Part 5. Standard operating procedures, task and incident management. Flawless commercial execution requires an unbreakable paper trail, period. Whenever a system fails, it's a strict four-step dance. First, identify and document the issue with proof. Second, proactively escalate it to the director. Third, sit tight and await explicit authorization. And fourth, delegated execution. You never, ever act outside your designated authority. Let's apply this to a real-world scenario. Say you hit a software bug. You grab a screenshot for proof, and you escalate that directly to the director to establish the systemic failure right away. What you absolutely do not do is try to fix it yourself. You wait for explicit authorization, and only then do you pass that documented paper trail over to the tech lead to get it fixed. On top of that, you have to manage upward. In this setting, silence is a failure. If leadership ever messages you asking, "Hey, what's the progress on this?" Trust me, that is not a casual check-in. It is a critical, blazing red warning that you have totally failed to proactively report your status. Part 6. Validating the clinical story. Delivering value. Because ultimately, our primary mandate as we scale is to remember that raw data is completely useless on its own. You can't just hand a patient a giant spreadsheet and expect them to understand it. That data has to be rigorously double-checked, interpreted through our clinical framework, and then woven into a cohesive, validated clinical narrative, a story that actually makes sense and changes the patient's life. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Having good intentions and being a smart scientist, it's simply not enough anymore. You really have to decide, are you going to cling to the academic mindset of the past, or are you ready to adapt to the hardcore commercial accountability required to actually scale these longevity treatments and bring them to the world?